Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Parent Like a Professional. Today, we're going to talk about behavioral functions. And what does that mean? Anybody?
Lots of things.
It means lots of things. But, why do we do what we do? Why is so-and-so doing A, B, and C? So, behavioral functions. When we talk about behavioral functions, sometimes we're thinking of, or as professionals who have dealt with individuals that have some different types of challenges communicating what they want and need. A lot of times people are trying to communicate, but they're using maybe a maladaptive behavior or something that's inappropriate when trying to communicate their wants and needs. So, for example, and please jump in, any of you, you may have experienced in the past when you have a little one who's screaming and crying when they want food. And typically that's appropriate with an infant because an infant can't, other than cry, communicate when they're thirsty. So when an infant is crying, the mother picks the baby up and she feeds her baby. And so we say in the field of psychology, our specific branch, behavior analysis, that she is reinforcing that crying behavior. Unfortunately, as time goes by, what we see is that some individuals continue, and I say the parents and maybe others that are around that are caregivers, continue to reinforce that kind of behavior. And it shapes up to just not a crying, but it shapes up to a screaming and crying and maybe, some other type of maladaptive behaviors, which are the negative side effects that we would not want to see with a 3, 4, and 5 year old. However, I think we can say it's safe to say that when an individual is screaming and crying and they're getting their needs met, that's a form of communication and it's functional communication. Although inappropriate, it's functional communication. So, thoughts, everybody. Tell me your experiences. What are your thoughts on this?
I think as a parent, like a first time parent, even like as a BCBA in this field
What's a BCBA again to remind
a
our
board certified behavior analyst.
Okay, that's right. And so those that hold their board certification have gone through a rigorous set of classes, or they had to go through, coursework that's required to be eligible to sit for an exam. And, so these are individuals that understand behavioral functions and understand how it's applied, how behavior analysis is applied to not only children, teenagers, and young adults, but the world in general outside of, behavioral issues. So, okay, Stephanie, thank you. So tell us
Yep.
more. Share.
So I think as a parent and being a BCBA before parent and thinking that I just knew everything that there was to know about everything, and then becoming a parent, it was different. When I would hear my son cry, when he hadn't learned how to engage in functional language, right? So he wasn't able to say words and communicate that way. And so I found myself as a parent having a hard time not reinforcing those behaviors and instead trying to prompt some other form of communication, of whether it's vocal language, sign language. And I think that we've discussed in the past, like for him, it was going to sign language because he
Mhm.
wasn't forming the right sounds or saying the right words. And it was easy to teach that and get his
Mhm.
wants and needs met that way. But it took me a long time. And I do this. This is my, but as a parent, it was very gray, and I had to actually step out and be like, okay, what is going on? How can what can I do differently to increase this functional, more functional communication, as opposed to like the whining and the crying, and then being able to have everyone else in his life do the same thing.
So I've known you and Harrison since day zero, right? With
Hmm.
little Harrison, and I think it's really common, more and more common. You're seeing people that are teaching their young children, to use sign language so that they can communicate their wants and needs, as opposed to engaging in some type of, maladaptive behavior, screaming, tantrums, aggression. Yeah, which I think is great. And then, like you, Stephanie, because you've shared so many stories in the past, with some of the challenges that like typical challenges, nothing that's outside of the norm, but some of the challenges you had with having Harrison communicate is you also, were working on getting him to use some sort of vocal mode of communication while he was using sign language, which I think that's a lot more popular these days than it was when I was raising my children when they were infants, 17, 16, 15 years ago. But
Yeah.
yeah, so you were saying that there were some challenges like, the transition going from, okay, we have an infant who is crying because they want their needs met. And now we have somebody who is starting to communicate in other ways. Where do we stop reinforcing the crying and start prompting or shaping, through reinforcement, other more appropriate forms of behavior?
Yeah.
Monica Yanokita, share with us your story with your three.
Well, it's hard to remember the first one, but I think that one thing too is like just talking to other parents and with really little kids that before language, but they're able to be mobile and they can they know more what they want. We're not talking about like infants, but looking at like the cursor behaviors too, I think is really important because a lot of times they're trying to tell you something and you're not noticing those things, and then it escalates to those more, tantrum or maladaptive behavior. So like sometimes they want to pull you to show you something, or they're pointing to something.
So those are the precursors that you're talking about. So
yeah.
So
Yep,
if you're not looking at, like, because pointing too can be a very appropriate form of communication depending on the individual. Like if somebody's already able to use language as or some sort of vocal verbal mode of communication to express their wants and needs, then maybe we don't want them to point at things. But prior to that, pointing is a lot better than screaming and crying. But then what you're saying is the pointing could be an example of something that happens before they are actually engaging in the type of communication that we would expect, want during that moment in time. And that's telling us maybe they need a little bit of assistance or a prompt to ask for the item in the most appropriate way.
Right.
I read this a while back and I can't remember where, so I can't cite it, but I remember reading something about how, when children turn 3, they become the little generals. They're always telling people, their parents, what to do. They're in command, and they've been in charge for the first 3 years of their life, right? So when they cry, they get comfort. When they cry, they get food. When they cry, they get their toy. And at some point, when they're already using language by 3, with typically developing children, now they're using language to control their environment, which is great. But then there's that transition with, okay, now I can't give them everything they want all the time. I'm going to have to change that schedule so that, sometimes they get what they want and sometimes they don't. And that's part of life. Marquis, Monica.
One thing I really remember with my second is that it wasn't so much getting something, but it was like taking things away, or when it was time to take a nap or switch things. And he would always tantrum. I mean, he just did not want to stop whatever he was doing a lot of times because he's doing something fun. When we introduced, I know we've talked about this before, the 1 more minute. So instead of tantruming, we transitioned for him to say, "Can I have 1 more minute?" And he had like some verbal, but it was a lot of like, 1 more minute, like not really clear. And then we would allow him 1 more minute, and then he would transition just fine. So getting those like little kind of teaching him that little language just totally changed how he was able to transition, and allowing him that 1 more minute, which most of the time, 95% of the time, is fine. 1 extra minute, but it allowed him to be a little bit more in control of the stopping. And that was like a big thing for us.
Well, we were talking about earlier, like, hey, this is going to be a topic about behavioral functions, or like, why do people, children, or young, toddlers, children, teenagers, adults, why are we doing what we're doing? What's the purpose of it? Like trying to discover or identify, I should say, why is so-and-so throwing a tantrum? And the idea with identifying the function of behavior, like, hey, they want something, or they don't want to do something, or they want to be left alone. Regardless, once we can identify why they're doing what they're doing, we can give them some sort of what we call like a replacement behavior or a functional alternative. And so if an individual doesn't want to do something or wants to leave the room, or we say, they want to escape the situation, and we're trying to teach them how to use words to ask for, something to eat or drink, we failed on discovering why they're engaging in maladaptive behaviors and to find a functionally equivalent replacement, something that will allow them to communicate what it is they're trying to communicate. If we're able to identify that, then we're going to be able to prompt them or show them or teach them, the way to go about getting what it is you want. So I think, again, the purpose of understanding behavioral functions is so that we can determine what, as a parent, is our next step, so that we can teach our child what it is that they need to do so that they can get what they want. Because ultimately, I think, and, I heard Jordan Peterson say this, he's a clinical psychologist. He said, we have one of our jobs as parents is to make our children likable by others. And I'm like, I like that. We have to make our children likable by others so that they're easily accepted into the social community that they're in. So if we can teach them how to communicate in the most appropriate way, they have a higher probability of being liked by the members of the community that they're in.
Mhm.
Other thoughts, Marky Helms, what can you share with us with your experiences working with families that have young children or even older children that communicate in ways that might not be considered appropriate?
Well, you know, one common thing that I hear from parents when they are starting this journey and they have no experience, they haven't worked with us yet, is when they talk about behavior, it just happens. It's just this thing that my kid does. They just do it. It's them. But what we're trying to focus on here when we talk about functions is that behavior does not occur in a vacuum. There are things that happen before that behavior and things that happen after that behavior that you should be in charge of. And behavioral functions is sort of your guide on that journey for how do you choose those different things that are going to serve as consequences or happen before the behavior. So behavior doesn't just happen. It's happening for communication, or there's something in the environment that needs to change and maybe evoking that behavior.
Yeah.
I don't
So
know if you guys have heard parents say that before, like, that's just what my kid does.
Right. And
Yes.
what's really, really interesting and very good point, it's like what happens right before, we call those antecedents, and what, and Monica mentioned precursors. What happens right before and what happens right after, because what happens before is usually what sets the occasion, or what we say sometimes is what evokes, the behavior that we're observing. So let's say what happens right before is that the individual hasn't had anything to eat for hours, so they're food deprived. So all of a sudden, we don't realize that because we don't really see some sort of specific action. It's almost like it's invisible, right? Because of that hunger. And then they start to scream and cry, and we're like trying to figure out, this came out of nowhere. Why is so-and-so doing what they're doing? And then as a consequence, we're probably doing other things that might be either reinforcing or making the situation even, worse, when we cannot identify what's happening before or after. So, the idea is that, as parents, as professionals, we want to identify not just like, hey, this is the behavior, but what happens before and what typically happens after, and what can we change in, and that's what we call the environment. What can we change in this person's environment so that we can ideally get the behavior, the type of functional communication that we're looking for? What can we do so that we can ensure that there's a higher probability that that'll happen, the next time come around when he or she is hungry or in that similar situation? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyways, we would love that we could talk about this for hours. We'd love to hear from all of you, some of your experiences, so that we can ideally pick some of your experiences and address them here at PLP in our next episode. So please share your experiences. Please comment if you feel that you have something that you'd like us to share, with the rest of the audience. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.